The warm September sun filtered through the tall windows of the Washington Memorial Library, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors of the main hall. Dr. Marcus Johnson stood at the entrance, watching as people of all ages and backgrounds filed in for his annual community lecture series. At 45 years old, he cut an impressive figure in his navy blue blazer and neatly pressed khaki pants, his salt and pepper hair adding to his distinguished appearance. The library's event coordinator, Mrs. Patricia Chen, hurried over to him with a clipboard in hand. "Dr. Johnson, we have a full house today, 300 seats filled, and people are still coming in." Her excitement was contagious, and Marcus smiled warmly at the news. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he started these community lectures 5 years ago. The main hall had been transformed for the occasion. Rows of comfortable chairs faced the podium, and behind it, a large screen was ready for his presentation. On the walls, photographs from various periods of American history created a timeline that wrapped around the room. Marcus had carefully selected each image to tell the story of America's diverse heritage. As people settled into their seats, Marcus observed the crowd. There were college students with notebooks ready, elderly couples who had attended every year, young professionals on their lunch breaks, and families with children old enough to understand the importance of history. The diversity in the room reflected the changing face of Washington, D.C., and it made his heart swell with pride. Among the attendees, Marcus noticed a group of high school students who had come with their history teacher. They sat near the front, their eyes wide with anticipation. He had visited their school last month, and their enthusiasm for learning about American history had impressed him deeply. At the back of the room, a middle-aged white woman entered, looking somewhat out of place and uncomfortable. She chose a seat near the exit, her body language tense and defensive. Marcus made a mental note to try to engage her during the discussion period, as he believed these lectures were most valuable for those who might feel challenged by them. Mrs. Chen approached the podium and tapped the microphone gently. The soft conversations throughout the room gradually died down as she began her introduction. "Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 5th Annual Community Lecture Series at Washington Memorial Library. We are honored to have with us today Dr. Marcus Johnson, Professor of African American History at Georgetown University." As Marcus made his way to the podium, he carried with him not just his presentation materials, but the weight of responsibility he felt to bridge divides and foster understanding. His laptop contained carefully researched family histories, including his own, which traced back to the earliest days of American history. The presentation he had prepared was titled "The Shared Threads of American Identity," a topic he had spent months researching and developing. The screen behind him came to life with the first slide, showing a tapestry of faces from different eras of American history. The image included photographs of Native Americans, European immigrants at Ellis Island, African Americans during the Great Migration, Asian railroad workers, and modern-day Americans of all backgrounds. Today, Marcus began, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hall, "We're going to explore a story that belongs to all of us. It's a story of struggle and triumph, of pain and healing, of division and unity." He paused, making eye contact with various members of the audience, including the uncomfortable woman at the back. "It's the story of America, but not as you might have learned it in school." The audience leaned forward slightly, drawn in by his calm and authoritative presence. Nobody in the room could have predicted how this ordinary afternoon would transform into one of the most memorable moments in their community's recent history. As Marcus prepared to advance to his next slide, he noticed a slight movement at the back of the room. The woman near the exit had shifted in her seat, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Little did any of them know that in just a few hours, this peaceful gathering would become the setting for a confrontation that would challenge their assumptions, test their character, and ultimately lead to an extraordinary lesson in human understanding. Dr. Marcus Johnson's presentation had been running smoothly for 45 minutes. His slides showed powerful images of different American communities working together throughout history, and the audience remained deeply engaged. Even the usually restless high school students at the front sat perfectly still, their phones forgotten in their pockets. Sarah Bennett, the woman who had been sitting near the exit, had grown increasingly agitated during the lecture. Her hands gripped the edges of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Every few minutes, she would shake her head slightly or mutter something under her breath. The elderly gentleman sitting next to her had begun to inch his chair away uncomfortably. As Marcus moved into the portion of his talk addressing systemic inequalities in American history, Sarah's face grew redder. He was explaining how certain historical policies had affected different communities when she suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The harsh sound cut through the quiet room like a knife. "This is ridiculous." Sarah's voice trembled with emotion. "All you people do is complain about America. If you've hated so much here, why don't you just go back to Africa?" The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. Someone in the audience gasped. A mother quickly covered her young daughter's ears. The high school students in the front row turned around in their seats, their mouths open in shock. Mrs. Chen, who had been standing near the door, took a step forward but stopped when Marcus raised his hand slightly. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room seemed to be holding their breath. Some looked at their feet, others stared at Sarah in disbelief, and many turned to Dr. Johnson, waiting to see how he would handle this ugly moment. Marcus stood perfectly still behind the podium. The presentation screen behind him showed a photograph of soldiers from different backgrounds fighting together in World War II. The contrast between the image of unity and the scene unfolding in the room was striking. Sarah wasn't finished. Her voice grew louder as she continued. "My grandparents worked hard to build this country. They didn't get any handouts. I'm sick of people like you making white people feel guilty about everything." Several audience members began to stand up, their faces showing anger and disapproval. A young man in the middle row called out, "That's enough. Show some respect." Others joined in with similar protests, and the room started to feel like a powder keg ready to explode. Marcus watched as the situation threatened to spiral out of control. He noticed a security guard moving toward the back of the room and knew he had to act quickly to prevent the situation from escalating further. His years of experience in handling difficult classroom discussions had prepared him for moments like this. He removed his glasses slowly and deliberately, placing them carefully on the podium. This simple action, performed with such calm purpose, somehow caught everyone's attention. The angry murmurs in the room began to quiet down. Marcus's face showed no anger, no hurt, no frustration, only a gentle, almost grateful smile. It was an expression that confused everyone in the room, especially Sarah, who had expected, perhaps even wanted, a very different reaction. "Mrs. Bennet," he said softly, yet clearly enough for everyone to hear. The fact that he knew her name surprised her. She had signed in at the front desk but hadn't expected him to notice. "Thank you for your honesty. You've just given us an incredible teaching opportunity." The tension in the room shifted. Confusion replaced anger as people tried to understand his unexpected response. Sarah, who had been standing defiantly, seemed to deflate slightly, thrown off balance by his calm demeanor and genuine smile. Marcus stepped out from behind the podium for the first time since beginning his lecture. He walked to the center of the stage, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows illuminated him as he stood there, creating what would later be described by many as an almost ethereal moment. "If you'll permit me," he continued, his voice warm and inviting, "I'd like to share something with you, with all of you, that might surprise you." He reached for his laptop, preparing to pull up a different set of slides than what he had planned. "It's a story about two families, yours and mine, Mrs. Bennet, and their shared American journey." The library's main hall remained absolutely silent as Dr. Marcus Johnson logged into his laptop. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, showing no sign of the tension that still hung in the air. Behind him, the screen went dark for a moment, then flickered back to life with a new set of images. Sarah Bennet remained standing, but her aggressive posture had softened slightly. Confusion crossed her face as she watched Marcus work calmly at his computer. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. There was no anger, no defensiveness, no call for security to remove her. Several people who had stood up to confront her slowly sank back into their seats, equally puzzled by the turn of events. Mrs. Chen moved quietly through the room, gently asking people to remain seated and give Dr. Johnson a chance to continue. The high school students in the front row had pulled out their phones, but instead of texting or browsing social media, they were recording what was happening. Their history teacher nodded approvingly, recognizing that they were witnessing something worth documenting. Marcus straightened up from his laptop and walked to the center of the stage again. He picked up a small remote control from the podium as he passed it. The afternoon sun had shifted, and now it cast long shadows across the floor, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere in the room. You know, he began, his voice warm and conversational, as if he were chatting with old friends rather than addressing a room full of tension. I always carry these extra slides with me to every lecture. They're part of a different presentation I give about American genealogy and family histories. I'd never had to use them during this lecture series before, but something told me to bring them today. He clicked the remote, and the screen showed an old black and white photograph of a Civil War soldier in Union Army uniform. The image was remarkably well preserved, showing a young man standing proud and tall, his hand resting on a sword at his side. This, Marcus said, is First Sergeant James Bennett, who served in the 54th Ohio Infantry during the Civil War. He turned to look directly at Sarah, whose face had lost some of its color. I believe he was your great-great-grandfather, wasn't he, Mrs. Bennett? Sarah's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She slowly sank back into her chair, her eyes fixed on the image of her ancestor. The elderly gentleman who had previously moved away from her now leaned forward with interest. Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing another Civil War soldier, this one in a different unit. And this is Private William Johnson, my great-great-grandfather, who served in the 29th United States Colored Infantry. These two men actually fought in some of the same battles, though they probably never met personally. The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with curiosity rather than tension. Marcus walked slowly down the steps from the stage, remote still in hand, each step deliberate and measured. The sound of his shoes on the wooden floor echoed slightly in the quiet room. I discovered this connection while doing research for my book on Civil War histories of Washington, D.C. families, he continued, stopping halfway down the center aisle. Your great-great-grandfather, Mrs. Bennett, was an extraordinary man. Did you know he was wounded twice while fighting to preserve the Union and end slavery? Sarah's hands, which had been clenched in fists, slowly relaxed in her lap. A tear rolled down her cheek as she stared at the image of her ancestor. Marcus took a few more steps toward her, his movement careful and non-threatening. I have a choice to make right now, Marcus said, addressing not just Sarah but the entire room. We all have a choice to make when we face moments like this. We can let anger divide us further, or we can use this as an opportunity to learn from each other and grow stronger together. He held up the remote control, his finger hovering over the button. I have more to share about both our families' histories, Mrs. Bennett, if you're willing to learn. Are you interested in taking this journey with me? The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Sarah's response. The afternoon sun caught the tears on her cheeks as she slowly, almost imperceptibly, nodded her head. Marcus clicked to the next slide, revealing a yellow document from 1741. The handwriting was faded but still readable, showing a ship's manifest from Charleston Harbor. Sarah leaned forward in her seat, her earlier hostility replaced by growing curiosity. This document, Marcus explained, walking slowly through the center aisle, lists the arrival of my earliest documented ancestor in America. His name was Samuel Johnson, and he was brought here against his will on a ship called the Morning Star. He paused, letting the information sink in. That means my family has been here for 284 years. The next slide showed a series of military documents arranged side by side. These are service records, Marcus continued, his voice steady and clear. My ancestors fought in every major American conflict. Samuel's grandson James fought in the Revolutionary War. His son Thomas served in the War of 1812. Then came William, who we just saw, in the Civil War. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand as Marcus clicked through more slides. The images told a story of two families, the Johnsons and the Bennetts, weaving through American history like parallel threads in the same fabric. And here, Marcus said, showing a photograph from World War I, is my grandfather Richard Johnson, standing next to a man named Charles Bennett. He turned to Sarah again. Your grandfather, I believe? Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. After a few moments of searching, she held it up, showing an old family photo. That's the same picture, she whispered, her voice cracking. My mom has it hanging in her living room. Several people in the audience moved closer to see the photo on Sarah's phone. The elderly gentleman next to her gently patted her shoulder, offering silent support as she struggled with her emotions. Marcus nodded encouragingly. Yes, they served together in the 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Your grandfather and mine were part of the longest-serving unit in World War I. They spent 191 days in combat together. He clicked to another slide showing newspaper clippings from the 1960s. And here's something remarkable. While I was researching for my book, I found these articles about civil rights demonstrations in Washington, D.C. Look at these two names in the article about business owners who supported integration. The screen showed two highlighted names, Michael Bennett and David Johnson. Your father and my father, Marcus said softly, both took stands for what was right, even when it wasn't popular. They never knew each other, but they were both working toward the same goal, a better America for everyone. Sarah's shoulders shook as she began to cry openly now. A young woman sitting nearby offered her a tissue, which she accepted with trembling hands. Marcus set down his remote and walked to where Sarah sat. He pulled up an empty chair and sat down next to her, his movements unhurried and gentle. The audience watched in respectful silence as history and humanity unfolded before them. Mrs. Bennett, he said quietly, though his voice carried in the silent room, when you tell me to go back to Africa, you're not just speaking to me. You're speaking to 11 generations of my family who helped build this nation. You're speaking to the memory of my great-great-grandfather who fought alongside yours to keep this country united. You're speaking to your own grandfather's brother-in-arms who stood with him in the trenches of France. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. This is my great-grandfather's naturalization paper from 1867. He was one of the first black men to become a citizen after the Civil War. On that same day, your great-great-grandfather was there as a witness. His signature is right here at the bottom. Sarah stared at the document, her tears falling freely now. The anger that had filled her just minutes ago seemed to have drained away completely, replaced by something that looked like a mixture of shame and wonder. The atmosphere in the library hall had transformed completely. What began as a hostile confrontation had become an impromptu history lesson that held everyone spellbound. Dr. Marcus Johnson stood up from his chair beside Sarah Bennett and walked back to the stage, ready to share more of their intertwined family histories. Now, Marcus said, clicking to a new slide showing a map of Africa, let's talk about Africa, since that's where this conversation started. The map was marked with different colored lines showing various migration patterns throughout human history. This continent is where all of humanity began. Every single person in this room can trace their oldest ancestors back to Africa. Sarah shifted in her seat, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue. The high school students in the front row had stopped recording and were now taking notes, their pens moving quickly across paper. Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing a map of Europe. Mrs. Bennett, your family's journey to America began here, in Ireland, during the potato famine of the 1840s. Your ancestors, like millions of others, were forced to leave their homeland because of hunger and poverty. He paused, letting that sink in. They didn't want to leave their home either. They had to survive. The next slide showed a series of immigration documents. When the Bennetts arrived at Ellis Island, they faced discrimination too. Signs in shop windows read, "No Irish need apply." They were called names, told they weren't real Americans, told to go back to where they came from. Several audience members of Irish descent nodded in recognition of this shared history. An elderly woman in the third row wiped away tears. But here's what makes America unique, Marcus continued, moving to a new slide showing a patchwork of faces from different ethnic backgrounds. We're all immigrants or descendants of immigrants, whether we came by choice, by force, or by necessity. Even Native Americans, the first Americans, originally crossed from Asia thousands of years ago. There is no going back because America is our shared home now. He clicked through more slides, showing historical photographs of different immigrant groups. Chinese workers building railroads, Italian families passing through Ellis Island, Mexican braceros working in fields, Vietnamese refugees arriving after the war. Every group that came to America faced challenges, Marcus explained, his voice gentle but firm. Every group was told at some point to go back to where they came from, but they stayed, they worked, they built, they became American, and so did we. The next slide showed a moving image, a black and white photograph of two young boys, one black and one white, playing together on a sidewalk. This photo was taken in Washington, D.C. in 1939, Marcus said, smiling at the image. The white boy is Michael Bennett Jr., your uncle, Mrs. Bennett. The black boy is my father, David Johnson. They were neighbors for 3 years before housing segregation forced my family to move. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. I remember that photo, she whispered. It's in my mother's old album. She never told me who the other little boy was. Marcus nodded. Our family's lives have been intertwined for generations, Mrs. Bennett. Not just through war and official documents, but through small, human moments like this one. 2 little boys who didn't know anything about race or hatred, just playing together on a summer day. He moved to another slide showing modern-day DNA results. Today, science can tell us exactly where our ancestors came from. My DNA shows that I'm 73% West African, 24% European, and 3% Native American. This means that some of my ancestors were African kings, some were European settlers, and some were indigenous Americans. Every one of them contributed to who I am today. The sun had shifted again, casting golden light across the room as Marcus walked back down to where Sarah sat. So you see, Mrs. Bennett, when you tell me to go back to Africa, you're not just denying my family's American story, you're denying part of your own. Because America isn't about where we came from, it's about what we built together, what we've suffered together, and what we can become together. Sarah Bennett sat quietly for a long moment, staring at the photograph of the 2 little boys playing together. The tissue in her hand was crumpled and wet with tears. Around her, the audience waited in respectful silence, many of them wiping away their own tears. I remember something else, Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother used to talk about a family that lived next door when she was young. The mother's name was Rose. She looked up at Marcus questioningly. Marcus's face lit up with recognition. Rose Johnson, he said warmly. My grandmother. She was famous in the neighborhood for her sweet potato pies. Sarah's eyes widened. Yes, that's it. Grandma said she learned her pie recipe from a neighbor named Rose. She shook her head in disbelief. I've been making that same sweet potato pie for every Thanksgiving since I was a girl. It's my family's tradition now, but it came from your family? Marcus smiled and pulled out his phone. After a few swipes, he showed Sarah a photograph of an old, handwritten recipe card. My grandmother's original recipe. Look at the bottom. Sarah leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Written in faded pencil at the bottom of the card were the words, "Shared with love, Betty Bennett, 1937. Betty was your grandmother," Marcus explained gently. She and my grandmother Rose exchanged recipes over their back fence. They couldn't socialize openly because of segregation, but they found ways to share friendship anyway. The high school teacher raised her hand hesitantly. When Marcus nodded, she asked, "Do you still make that pie, Dr. Johnson?" "Every Thanksgiving," Marcus replied. He looked at Sarah again. "Same as your family. We've been making the same pie for generations, never knowing we were keeping alive a friendship that segregation tried to break apart." Sarah stood up slowly, her legs shaking slightly. "I have something to show you too," she said, digging through her large purse. She pulled out a worn leather wallet and carefully removed an old folded piece of paper. "My grandfather gave me this before he died. I never understood what it meant until now." Marcus took the paper carefully and unfolded it. It was a letter, yellowed with age but still readable. As his eyes scanned the words, his own tears began to fall. "It's a letter from your grandfather to mine," Sarah explained to the silent room. "Written from the hospital in France, where they were recovering from their war wounds. He wrote that without your grandfather, he wouldn't have survived. He called him brother." Marcus nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice again, he said, "In my research, I found records showing they were wounded in the same battle. Your grandfather carried mine to safety under heavy fire, then stayed with him until help arrived. They saved each other's lives more than once during that war." An elderly man in the audience stood up slowly. "I'm a veteran too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's what war teaches you. Blood all runs red. Doesn't matter what color the skin is." Sarah looked around the room, seeing the faces of people she had earlier viewed with anger and suspicion. Now she saw them differently, as people with their own stories, their own family histories, all connected in ways she had never imagined. "Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice stronger now though tears still ran down her face, "my grandmother's pie recipe. Would you like to see if it matches yours? Maybe we could bake them together and see if they taste the same? Marcus smiled warmly. I'd like that very much, Mrs. Bennet, and please, call me Marcus. After all, he gestured to the letter she had shared. Our grandfathers were brothers in arms. That makes us family too, in a way. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the library windows, illuminating the scene as Sarah stood and, after a moment's hesitation, stepped forward to hug Marcus. The audience burst into applause, not just for the moment they were witnessing, but for the healing of wounds that had festered for generations. The emotional scene between Marcus and Sarah had opened something in the room that could not be closed. People began to stand up, one by one, wanting to share their own family stories. Mrs. Chen quickly brought out a microphone so everyone could hear the impromptu sharing session. A young Asian woman in her 20s was the first to speak. Her hands trembled as she held the microphone. My grandfather was in one of those Japanese internment camps during World War II, she said. But when he got out, a black family gave him a job at their restaurant when no one else would hire Japanese Americans. That restaurant job helped him restart his life. An elderly Hispanic man spoke next. In 1955, my father crossed the border with nothing but hope. A white farmer gave him work, helped him get his papers, even taught him English. That farmer's son is still my best friend today. Story after story poured out, each one a thread in the complex tapestry of American history. The high school students, who had been recording everything, now put down their phones and began sharing too. One girl spoke about her immigrant mother from Nigeria who worked as a nurse. Another talked about his great-grandfather who fled the Holocaust and found sanctuary in America. Sarah listened to each story with tears in her eyes. The anger that had brought her to stand up earlier seemed like a distant memory now. When someone passed her the microphone, she took a deep breath. I need to apologize, she said, her voice shaky but clear. Not just to Dr. Johnson, but to all of you. I've been carrying around so much anger, blaming others for my own struggles. But listening to everyone's stories, we've all struggled. We've all faced hardships, and we've all helped each other overcome them, even when we didn't know it. Marcus put a gentle hand on her shoulder. That's what makes America unique, Mrs. Bennet. It's not about where we came from, but how we came together. A local news reporter who had been quietly filming the entire event raised her hand. Dr. Johnson, Mrs. Bennet, would you be willing to share your story with our viewers? I think people across the country need to hear this. Before Marcus could answer, a student from the high school group stood up excitedly. We've been recording everything. We could make a documentary for our history project. Show how all our family's stories connect. Mrs. Chen hurried to the front of the room with her clipboard. We could start a community history project, she suggested. Regular meetings where people share their family stories. Dr. Johnson, would you help guide it? The energy in the room was electric now. People were exchanging phone numbers, making plans, sharing ideas. The elderly veteran who had spoken earlier was showing his war medals to the high school students. Two women who had been sitting on opposite sides of the room discovered their grandparents had worked in the same factory in the 1960s. Sarah turned to Marcus with a new light in her eyes. All these years, I thought being American meant protecting what my ancestors built. But it's not about protecting. It's about connecting. About finding these hidden threads that tie us all together. Marcus nodded, watching the scene unfold before them. Every family has a story, he said. And when we share those stories, we find out they're all chapters in the same big book. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, tugged at Sarah's sleeve. My mommy says you're going to make pies with Dr. Johnson, she said shyly. Can I help? I like making pies. Sarah looked at Marcus, who smiled and nodded. Of course you can, sweetheart, Sarah said, kneeling down to the girl's level. And while we bake, maybe your mommy can tell us your family's story too. The afternoon sun was setting now, casting long shadows through the library windows, but nobody seemed eager to leave. What had started as a lecture transformed into a confrontation and then blossomed into something entirely unexpected. A moment of community healing that promised to grow far beyond the walls of the library. 3 months after that remarkable afternoon at the Washington Memorial Library, the community had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The local news story about Marcus and Sarah went viral, reaching millions of viewers across the country. But the real change happened in their own neighborhood. The library's main hall was packed once again, but this time for a different reason. It was the first annual American Family Stories Festival, organized jointly by Dr. Marcus Johnson and Sarah Bennett. Tables lined the walls, each one displaying family photographs, documents, and treasured heirlooms from different community members. Sarah stood at the entrance, greeting people with a warm smile. She wore a name tag that read Community History Committee Chair, a position she had enthusiastically accepted after Mrs. Chen suggested forming the committee. Next to her was a table displaying two identical sweet potato pies, made from the shared recipe that had connected her family with the Johnsons generations ago. The high school students who had witnessed the original event had completed their documentary, titled Hidden Threads: The Stories That Connect Us. It played on a loop on a large screen at the back of the hall, showing interviews with community members about their family histories. The students had won a state education award for the project, and schools across the country were requesting copies to use in their history classes. Marcus moved through the crowd, stopping to chat with various families. He paused at a display where the elderly veteran was showing his granddaughter a collection of letters from soldiers he had served with, men of all races who had fought alongside him. The veteran had become a regular speaker at local schools, sharing his message about unity and understanding. In one corner, a little girl who had asked to help bake pies was now part of a children's storytelling circle. Kids from different backgrounds sat together, sharing tales passed down from their grandparents. They had started a school project called My Family's Journey, inspiring other schools to create similar programs. The local newspaper had set up a booth where people could digitally record their family histories for an archive project. The reporter who had covered the original story was there, helping people preserve their memories for future generations. She had already collected over 300 family stories, each one revealing unexpected connections within the community. Sarah's daughter, who had never shown much interest in family history before, now stood proudly by their family's display table. She had discovered that her college roommate's great-grandfather had worked in the same coal mine as her great-grandfather. "Mom," she said, hugging Sarah, "I never knew our family story was so interesting." Marcus walked over to join them, carrying a thick book bound in leather. "The first copy," he said, handing it to Sarah. It was their jointly authored book, America's Hidden Threads: Finding Unity in Our Shared Stories. The cover showed a beautifully woven tapestry made up of family photographs from their community. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Sarah said softly, running her hand over the book's cover. 3 months ago, I was so full of anger and fear. Now look at all this." She gestured to the room full of people sharing stories, laughing, and discovering connections they never knew existed. Marcus smiled. "Sometimes the hardest moments can become the most important turning points. You had the courage to change, Sarah. That's what made all this possible." Mrs. Chen approached them with excitement. "The governor's office called," she announced. "They want to make this a statewide program. Every library in the state could host their own Family Stories Festival." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, just as it had on that fateful day 3 months ago, Marcus looked around the room. Children of all backgrounds played together, elderly people shared wisdom with teenagers, and families who might never have spoken to each other before now sat together, looking through old photographs and discovering shared histories. The sign above the library entrance had been changed, and now read, "Welcome to Washington Memorial Library, where every family's story matters." Below it, someone had added a quote, "In our differences, we find strength. In our connections, we find hope." The confrontation that could have ended in anger had instead sparked a movement of understanding that continued to grow, one family story at a time.